Herzlich willkommen.
Welcome. Welcome back to some of you, because we started off already last night with a very intriguing discussion. We had a short tour d'horizon and we'd like to continue with that today. We are going to zoom in on some of the topics that we only touched upon briefly yesterday. Let me make some housekeeping remarks to start off with. Everything will be broadcast via the live stream, everything that's going to happen in conference hall number 1. After the conference, you can also look up what was being discussed in the forum. You will find this on the Congress website as well as on Facebook, which fits in nicely, by the way. It would be very surprising if we did not have many people watch us in the social media. Hashtag Digital Capitalism is the title of it. And the discussion has already gained some momentum yesterday. If you would like to place comments or remarks in the social media, please feel free to do so. And if you want to take some analog materials with you, there is a hashtag printer out there in the forum, in the lobby. Today and all day long, we will start off with a discussion here in the panel, but after that, at the end of the session, we will open the floor for questions and remarks from the audience. And these are basically all the logistical remarks I'd like to make. Now we are going to zoom in on digital monopolies. In the preparation, I remembered a short story that occurred when I was young. When I was a student, I went to the PC Pole of the Humboldt University, where I met one of my fellow students who was completely enthusiastic in the mid-90s. Then the internet was completely new. And if you ran a web search in the internet, you occasionally used this search engine or that engine. You know, the other day, Yahoo occurred to me, and the fellow student of mine had discovered Google that afternoon. The rest is history. We all know that the competitors which were in the market back then have ceased to exist, basically. Running a web search via Google is something that has culminated in the term, let us Google, and you can find it in the dictionary. It was a mail ordering system, Amazon, in the past. But now, Amazon has become a big player itself. And the fact that we're all using Facebook because everybody else is using Facebook is nothing of the extraordinary any longer. We know that for the market, for the consumer, it is not a really good thing if there is only one player in the market dominating everything. And this is why we would like to start off with a discussion on digital monopolies. The keynote speech will be delivered to us by a speaker whom we've had to hear anyways. Achim Wambach is here with us. He's the president and the chairman of the Antitrust Committee and the president of the Center for Economic Research in Mannheim. Welcome, the floor is yours.
Ja, vielen Dank. Wunderschön.
Thank you very much and good morning. I've prepared some slides, 5 in total. If you might be wondering, well, what else might be coming, there are only 5 slides that I've prepared for my presentation. Before we get started on how we deal with digital monopolies, let me make a preliminary remark. Is this really a new observation, or is it part of the development which has already set in? We have observed a lot of technological innovations, but digitization makes us a bit more nervous. And therefore, we need to cast a glance into the past. What were the economic structures like in the past and how have they developed? We are very much determined by the social market economy. On the left-hand side, you will find pictures of the protagonists over there. Ludwig Erhard, who was the Minister of Economics, who coined the term social market economy. And the third head down there is Walter Eucken from the Freiburg School. It developed a theory underlying the principles of social market economy. And there are constitutive and regulating principles that were developed for the social market economy. And what is most important is that the constituting components are prices. Who gets what? Allocation is based on prices. But now we've observed that prices are no longer of the essence. Things can be received for free. We're in the digital market economy, so we pay without having to pay money. We pay by using our data. So property and the very notion of it changes profoundly. In economic transactions, property was of the essence, but now we have the sharing economy. Things are being shared and swapped and changed. Eugen and the Freiburger School realized that the markets and the forces of the market can no longer regulate everything, and this is why the regulating principles were introduced. The most famous one is the control of monopolies, fair competition. But today the internet giants are out there in the markets and monopolies have emerged. Now we depend very much on SMEs in our social market economy, but now a new economic structure has developed. And the fourth point is also a regulatory principle. Demand anomalies in the labor market, because the labor market doesn't work on its own. And, I came up with a nicer wording, and I called it the social partnership, the social partners of industry. Can they still survive if we have click workers? There was a study revealing that lots and lots of jobs will be made redundant as a consequence of digitization. Can the social partners of industry still be maintained? On the right-hand side, you find the protagonists of the digital market economy. At the very top, Hal Berry, the chief economist of Google. Of course, I selected these people. He contributed to all the different options and market design problems that Google has to offer. If you want to place an advertisement, you have to choose between various different options. Down below, there is Susan Essig, who was a professor at Stanford, but she was the chief economist of Microsoft. And below, there's Pat Marjari, the chief economist of Amazon. Last year, 150 economists were hired by him to join a team in order to analyze the newly developed market structures and to create new markets. Microsoft has a research center where postdocs normally work for 2 years before they go back to university. So this is a totally dynamic area because these are completely new economic structures that have developed. Today we're going to zoom in on monopolies, digital monopolies. That's the topic on our agenda. But I would simply like to go back to these items on the list, but I can't really go into detail because this would be too far-reaching. The quote up there comes from the former Minister of Economics, Sigmar Gabriel. Germany wants to withstand, together with Europe, to the dictatorship of internet monopolies, and we are already doing that. On the left-hand side of the slide, you will find a list of the proceedings of the trials which are already pending in the antitrust monopoly, and down below, these are the cases which are being dealt with by the European Commission. There are many more, but these are the most important cases which are currently pending. We've all heard about the lawsuits against Google that were finalized in 2017 and 2018. The trial began in 2012. It took far too long, but nevertheless, the highest sentence was imposed on Google by the European Commission. Facebook is also sued for an abuse of power. This is one slight change that we can observe in our economic structure. So far, the antitrust commissions try to take measures against mergers. We didn't want companies to merge in order to get big, but these companies didn't become big because they merged, but out of their own strength. And now the feature is that they can be accused for abusing the power that they have accumulated out of their own strength. Economic dominance is not illegal, it's just illegal to buy it in, and this is merger control. But how can you make sure that this power is not going to be abused? There is another platform selling tickets for events that was accused of abusing its power. Eventis. If you want to buy a ticket for a concert, you can go via the platform and acquire a ticket there. It's a bit like a small Amazon. And here exclusive contracts were abandoned or were prohibited by the Antitrust Commission. Booking.com is also very well known to all of us. They had entered into contracts with hotels stipulating that on their own website they were not allowed to offer cheaper prices. So a lot of trials are currently going on. Action is supposed to be taken against Amazon, but that's much more difficult. Why? Because it's much more difficult to prove that Amazon has power in the market, because in the individual markets they're not really powerful. I think the book market is where Amazon is the strongest. Here they hold a market share of 20%. Every fifth book is being sold via Amazon. But all the other four are being sold elsewhere, and therefore it's very difficult to accuse Amazon of abusing its power. Now, of course, we can talk about different options on how to take other actions against Amazon. The legislator is also very active. The data privacy legislation was adopted last year, where these factors were supposed to be taken into account. So here the stipulation goes, the assumption of the market does not have to be countered if a service is provided free of charge. You know, data and services are being offered free of charge. The same holds true for Google. The search engine is offered free of charge. And some courts rules that if services are offered free of charge, then this is not a market, because a market is based on an exchange. You give something in exchange for something else. But if this was not a market, Google would not be powerful. Google holds 90% of the market in the field of search engines, but this has now been put down in pieces of legislation. But you know, Google places advertisements and has the search engine that is offered free of charge. But you know, we also know this from other areas. There are newspapers which are disseminated free of charge, free for the user, but of course the newspapers make money with commercials. This is nothing new, but this is the platform economy, which is quite specific. In the second bullet point, platforms are being determined. If you have multifaceted markets and networks, the Antitrust Commission said, well, this was considered already in the past, but now it has been legally defined, and this is how it gets a new dynamism, because it can be used for furnishing evidence in the courts. And here you can get access to data relevant for competition. The Antitrust Commission now has the possibility, for consumer protection reasons, to analyze specific sectors. This is completely new as well, and was enshrined in our pieces of legislation. The Antitrust Commissions can analyze particular sectors, and if they think that things don't run smoothly, and if the consumers lodge a lot of complaints, and of course the consumers became very much aware of this, whenever new opportunities are given to the consumers by the Commission, they should be made use of. Then they started to take action against violations, against provisions for consumer protection. For consumer protection reasons, certain sectors that were analyzed had to be subjected to particular sanctions, because we need to be able to understand the markets much better than ever before. I'm happy that Google has filed a lawsuit against these accusations, because with regards to the Android decision, the mobile phone platform, Android is free of charge, but if you want to use it and if you want to download Google services, you've got to download the whole package. So all the services are pooled, and there is no way around Google. And the European Commission therefore argued that in the case of the search engine, Google puts its own product first and tried to protect other competitors out of the market. But they specified that these are their own products. Have they been labeled strongly enough? Is that obvious enough? There are a lot of questions which remain unanswered. And this is why it's a good idea that Google sued these companies, because expert reports have to be written, because this is a process where a lot still remains to be done. These tools have been adopted. The 10th amendment of the data privacy regulation is currently being worked on. And it would be interesting to see what is still in the pipeline. I told you that cases against abuse are the most important ones in the field of digital monopolies in order to take countermeasures. The second tool is still also very important, and that's merger control. This is a quotation from the Süddeutsche Zeitung. Try to catch the internet giants. You know, these were acquisitions. A merger means that two companies merge, but WhatsApp was purchased for 19 billion, Skype for 8, Nokia for 7, DoubleClick was 3 billion. You know, acquisitions have already existed, but you know, who were the buyers? These are the ones listed on the left-hand side. Google, Microsoft, Apple, Google, Yahoo. The big digital companies really acquire all the smaller players in the market, and this is of our greatest concern. Do they buy up their competitors? That seems to be the case. Now let me try to calm you down in a way, but here too, trials are currently underway on anti-merger control. Parship, Elite, Immonet, Immowelt, and Eventim and ProArtis are players against whom action has been taken. And also at the European level, a lot of proceedings are currently still underway. Here the big player is Brussels. Google, DoubleClick, but also Facebook and WhatsApp were analyzed by the European Commission. But the ruling was that this does not impair competition at all. Can we try to take countermeasures if somebody tries to buy up a potential competitor? Mr. Mund from the Antitrust Commission, does he say that this is a potential competitor? You know, you can't do this arbitrarily or deliberately, but, you know, this is a measure that works. Here the system is in full swing. But on to a second point. Expenditure for R&D. The companies that spend most on R&D are Amazon, and then second comes Alphabet. It's very difficult to read it. And in the third place, there is a blue bar for Volkswagen, a German company. The digital monopolies invest more into R&D than our strongest company that takes the lead in R&D, and that's Volkswagen, a company that uses machines in order to manufacture cars. But we're always saying monopolies are bad because they're too slow, nothing has happened there. You know, living in a monopoly is a life which is nice and quiet, but that's not the case. They don't rest on their laurels. They have a big R&D department. R&D is quite impressive. And this is why this is a double-bladed sword. Monopolies as such are a bad thing would be wrong to say. So therefore, anti-merger control is a very important measure. And measures against the abuse of power are the two most important tools that we should use consistently. Here the legislators have become active as well. In the law, one particular provision was changed. Not each and every merger does have to be prohibited, you know, if two donor shops merge. The Antitrust Commission does not necessarily have to take action, but if the turnover exceeds a certain level, if you reach a certain level with your total sales, then the Antitrust Commission should take action. WhatsApp did not make any turnover. The services were provided free of charge. So therefore, the Antitrust Commission was not really empowered to look at this particular case. But why did we do so anyways? Because there are 3 countries in Europe where you don't have a threshold concerning the turnover, but a purchasing price threshold. And the purchasing price at WhatsApp was high. It was purchased for 90 billion. So this matter was very important. And since 3 countries in Europe have this purchasing price threshold, the European Commission was asked to exert some control. And that is something that we also introduced in our German legislation, a purchasing price threshold. As an economist, you must say, well, of course, it's clear what this means. But if 2 companies merge and exchange shares, what's the purchasing price? Legally speaking, you have to break it down to the nitty-gritty. And in the Antitrust Commission, in the antitrust legislation, they also said that if the value exceeds 400 million euros in total, Antitrust Commission activities have to be triggered. You know, in these cases, these transactions have to be reported. I think in 10 cases the threshold was exceeded, but all these companies were given the green light. Anti-merger control takes normally 4 weeks. The Antitrust Commission either gives you a green light or else you get a red light, and then it takes 2 more weeks before you can look at the detail. In the field of merger control, a lot has happened, but there's lots of room for improvement as well. Facebook, WhatsApp, what went wrong? That's a very important question. And how can we all make sure that we include the necessary regulations in our pieces of legislation which are required in order to make sure that the Antitrust Commission takes action, because we don't want all these cases to be delegated to Brussels. But there is one additional point. These were some explanations about how we deal with the monopoly giants, but this is the stumbling block, you know. They offer a lot of excellent products, but we don't want them to abuse their power. So therefore we have merger control and control against the abuse of power. This is my last slide. The title is taken from a book which is called A Rift in Zero Prices, the Big Change of Paradigms. No marginal costs. No marginal cost was the price. Exactly, that's the title. Thank you very much. From market capitalism to collaborative commons, the share economy still requires somebody to be the owner. You know, if you share a car, still somebody has to be the owner. But, you know, I sublet my room to somebody else in my flat. In the past, I didn't do that. Now I don't do that. Now I can do this because these people have been evaluated. They have been assessed. They've booked 90 rooms before they booked mine, and they didn't cause any damage. So this is a major benefit. This leads to an ever higher level of prosperity in many different areas. New markets develop and new sectors emerge. And of course, this leads to a lot of friction. Uber and taxi are no longer friends. Airbnb competes with the hotels. The Deutsche Telekom and Skype are really competing with each other because you can use Skype to make phone calls. You know, the big telecom operators in the past made money with short messages. This is no longer the case. And in Germany, there is a great deal of reluctance vis-à-vis these companies. One great example is the ban of mail ordering in pharmaceutical products. You know, another question is, should this be banned? There's a great deal of reluctance because pharmacies are supposed to be preserved. But I think we should have a discussion about how this potential can be tapped, because we have to strike the right balance. How can the internet monopolies be limited? How can their scope be narrowed down? But the new markets which are emerging should also be tapped. This is why we have a new working group in place in the Commission, Competition 4.0, and it has got to fulfill both tasks. How can we tap the additional potential provided to us, and how can we make sure that the internet giants can be brought under control in order to prevent them from abusing their power? This brings me to the end of my presentation. There's one thing I learned in the digital economy. It's of the essence that you always pay attention, and you need to use your attention in order to use commercials. On my last slide, I'm not going to thank you for your attention, but I'm also going to advertise my book. And thank you very much for your attention.
You can already take your seat, and I would like to now open the next discussions. I would like to welcome Christina Kampmann. She's a member of the Regional Parliament in North Rhine-Westphalia, and she's the spokesperson for Digital Affairs. Professor Thomas Gegenhuber is with us. He's from the Leuphana University in Lüneburg, and he is an economist and focuses on digital transformation. Welcome to you too. Ulrich Sendler, so I think he took the floor last night already. He's back here, and he's a publicist, and he's a technical analyst as well. And also welcome to him. Thomas Fischer is with us. Unfortunately, Rainer Hoffmann had to cancel from the German Confederation of Trade Unions, and I would like to also welcome his deputy. You may have noticed Henning Tillmann unfortunately cancelled as well. but we were able to win Mr. Gegenhuber to replace him, Mr. Wambach. So let's get started with our panel discussion. But first of all, I would like to ask you a few questions. You said, and I've looked up this quote. Hang on a second. It would be great if I could find it straight away. And the quote is about the digital corporations and to control them, that you are controlling them. And my question is, how shall we notice? Well, I am an academic, and the Antitrust Commission just writes expert reports, and we don't really control anything, but that means that, however, so we are dealing with these issues, and in that regard, we are controlling it. And it's not only German and European corporations, but also the US has had a lot of proceedings in courts with these giants. And Google, at the outset, for example, had exclusive contracts so that the commercials that you ran via Google, you could not run on other platforms. And the American Antitrust Commission, they said that this is no longer possible, that this is no longer legal. And Google said that, all right, then we won't do that. And so they wouldn't have to accept any sanctions imposed on them. I mean, this is the way that we work. So, for example, what they did 5 years ago with these exclusive contracts, I mean, things like that have changed also here. So I think everybody can understand that also the activities that you have described, but Christina Kampmann. But at the end of the day, for the consumer, can they notice that there is some type of monopoly control when you think of Facebook or Google, the pluralism that we would like to have? Do we have it? So first of all, the question is, in what way do we want and how a pluralism, and what Professor Wambach said, but also the title of this event is something that I would like to place in a political context, and I would like to ask a provocative question as well. So especially against the backdrop of what you said, do we really want to shatter these monopolies, or don't they actually give a benefit to us consumers, which can be seen in the network effect, which says that the benefits for the consumers, for the customers, will be multiplied by so many people using the same platform, and which actually also means that this generates a monopoly. So, but the fact that many people are using it means that for them it is beneficial to use these platforms. And I would like to give you two examples of for the first time I went abroad. So I used StudiVZ, which is a German website, and as everybody did at the time. So everybody else, however, started using Facebook, and so I changed over to Facebook too. So, and I see that as an added value, that I can communicate to all my friends all over the world via Facebook. And then another example with WhatsApp, when Facebook took over WhatsApp, then I said I don't want to do that. So I went to use a messenger service that was incredibly safe and secure, but nobody else used it. So this type of messenger was no longer a benefit for me. So I still am not using WhatsApp, and I'm using a different service. But having said all that, means that the monopolies wouldn't be used by people if they didn't see a benefit in using them. And this is my political approach, to say that it is not about shattering these monopolies, but with my point of view, so it is three actions that we need to take. And this is also reflected in what you said, I think. So first of all, the monopolies that we have need to be regulated in such a way that the risks for the consumers are reduced. For example, when we talk about social media, so that this won't have a negative impact for elections and democracies. That would be one example. Or that the data of consumers are protected to such an extent that the risk is low for them to enter these data into the social networks. And then another example that you have also mentioned, and this is a milestone, which is the framework condition on data privacy, that is seen in a negative light, unfortunately, very often, but it had the aim to protect the data of people in Europe. And we can talk about the risks and that are involved, and the negative and adverse parts of this new legislation. But I think this was put in place in order to mitigate the risks. And then, may I just remind you that we haven't invited you to give a keynote speech this morning, so maybe you can very briefly go through your next points. I mean, this is just me being very brief in my comments to the presentation by Professor Wambach. And my second point is that we're also linked to what you said, so we need to make sure that we have pluralism, that small startups can get established in the market. And here I can give you another example for that. So, for example, the data sharing obligation, which Andrea Nahles integrated in the German newspaper Handelsblatt. And the third point is the control over mergers and acquisitions, and I believe that it is appropriate. I don't think that Facebook needs to own WhatsApp, and I think that we can do something about that. And I'm waiting to see what the competition on the Commission on the Competition 4.0 will publish later on. So do you also think that we have created some milestones with regard to data privacy and protection of the users? Because that is something very positive that we just heard from Christina Kampmann. Well, I can't agree with her at all. So unfortunately, this new regulation went into a direction which Google and Facebook and other internet giants are not really affected by. But a lot of smaller clubs, SMEs, people who are active on the internet, just like I am, they have been burdened with additional work and additional costs. So it doesn't really help much, because today, and I also do not agree with Professor Wambach in this, we do not have a regulation of property with regard to data, who owns data, and this is why we cannot make any regulations at all whatsoever which protects our property of data. But that would be essential, however, and it is going to be even more important when we look at what we didn't really discuss last night either, which is the major concern of humanity faced with digitalization. It can be taken back to the Internet of Things that started 5 years ago. And it is not only about these giants and the smartphones and all these devices, but rather that we can have a chip transplanted into our bodies, which is connected with the Internet, and that every product will become an Internet-connected product. And this is then giving rise to completely different sets of questions. And maybe a last point that I would like to make here, so with monopolies. You just said that you like it when people use, when many people use networks, and I also like that when many people use my networks, for example, but digitalization has already led to what Adam Greenfield did not really want to see, is that humanity has created new needs, and there is the need to be connected to everybody in the world, and it is already there. So you need many people in the network to be able to do that, and then it should be a monopoly, however, controlled by the state. And I am in favor of state-controlled monopolies in this context, and I also favor a general ban on using private data for commercial purposes, and this would make the discussion completely different. So it's not only controlling monopolies or shattering monopolies, but rather something else. I mean, actually, something like this already exists. Nebenan.de, it is a platform in Berlin, and it has more 1 million users in Germany. And this means 6,000 neighborhoods were not sharing any data, no ads that could disrupt your enjoyment of this platform, and I think that this is the way to go ahead. What about the economist, Thomas Gegenhuber? So when you hear of state-controlled monopolies, and especially when you think of these giants coming from the Silicon Valley, from the United States, I believe we all agree that if we want to have a basic need, this needs to be covered by the state, and state control may make sense in some contexts. When we look into the digital era, however, so I'm skeptical about that, and rather cautious, because these are platforms that are beyond our reach. And what I really like, and what I really find interesting, and this is also an economic question, so can we create alternative platforms, and what type of ecosystem do we have in in which alternative models and cooperatives can be generated, and to me that is very exciting and intriguing. So, but what Professor Wambach said is also true. We need to understand these new business models, and we need to understand the changes. We know that Mark Zuckerberg is very open and is very transparent with regard to the growth of these corporations, so that you offer good services and good products where that is well connected and is well working, and then keep people motivated by adding new functions and then acquiring new companies and earning money through that. And in a historical example, what happens when you don't understand this logic is the following. The British regulators, the United Kingdom Office of Fair Trading, in 2012, they analyzed Instagram being bought up by Facebook, and they did it completely wrong. So Instagram was evaluated as a photo application. It is not a photo application, but it is a social network. And then this authority was of the opinion that Instagram doesn't have any revenues at all, and Facebook is trying to make money. So, but of course, Instagram was not earning at the time because they were just acquiring new users. And so this was a fundamental error in not understanding the market and understanding the logic of these business models. If I understand it, once I understand that, then I should also understand that Facebook is buying Instagram because this is the social network buying a social network, because then this would create a major volumes of data and will create a monopoly. Right. Thank you. So I am getting nervous with regards to all these pieces of paper that you have in front of you. So thank you very much for your statement. I would like to give the floor to Thomas Fischer. And we heard from Ms. Kampmann. So if everybody wants to use these monopolies, maybe they're not that dangerous after all. So what about the view of the trade unions? Well, it is very difficult here now in my position to give my opinion against the SPD candidate from North Rhine-Westphalia. But let me start by saying that the problem with these data-based monopolies is that no one of us knows what potential is there for using our data, technically speaking. So I just want to give you three buzzwords. And I think that it's not sufficient to say these monopolies are wonderful because they create an additional benefit. And with click tracking, for example, that is a buzzword that shows the risks and the dangers, because these platforms can track the data that go beyond their own platforms. And nobody here knows that, because when we don't know what is done beyond the platforms that we're using. So this is basically something that we have no control over, so that the data that we enter into one platform and how they are used. I mean, of course, these possibilities, they will grow even further to the extent with mergers and acquisitions, so that the range of the potential use of data is widening. And this is why I am a fan of the law against restrictions on competition, so that the competition-related data was also looked at and analyzed, and not only the turnover and the sales figures, and because this is something that is very important with regard to their position in the market. And to be fair, I also need to add that you mentioned Andrea Nahles as well, so this law for data for everybody. So once the big monopolies will be forced to make their data available in an anonymized way, so that others can also enter the market, and which means that the competition will be intensified. And that is, in my view, a wonderful approach. And this is using the direct means of the antitrust legislations and the competition legislation. And I believe that in addition to the big data platforms, in short, big data, and this is a new point I would like to mention. So we'll also talk about decentralized technologies. And here I'm talking about blockchain technologies. So far, they have been mentioned when it is about certified services, but what these technologies can do at the outset is that the individuals have a control over their data in these networks. And then if you put that into cooperative models and in using blockchain technologies for sharing data, then I believe that this is a very interesting alternative to the giants that we have at the moment. And this may be an alternative which is actually more attractive to the consumers than what they have at the moment. And this takes me back to the very beginning. So because with the giants, we don't know what is happening with our data. And this is something that we need to do something about. With the blockchains, and Adam Greenfield just said that for the Bitcoin transactions, we use a lot, even more energy than Ireland uses as a country in total. So Christina Kampmann, I would like to give you the floor back to you so that you can respond to what has been said. But data privacy is a very delicate issue as well, I would say. And many consumers in the 21st century, they don't find it that important any longer. So what about those consumers who want to connect to others in the world, but they don't want to surrender their data to this giant Google? So this is always a very difficult question, and it's always an ambivalent question. But when we say in Germany and in Europe, so we focus on data privacy, and people find it very important. And at the same time, we see, however, that people nonetheless are on Facebook because right now there are no adequate alternatives. And this is why I believe, as you said, it is quite intriguing that when you talk about political and about regulatory measures, what we can do with regard to technological solutions that would counter this generation of giants. And I didn't mention blockchains at the outset because then I was afraid that would have to explain it. But I am a big fan because I believe that the blockchain technology is not only mirroring our European values and even social democratic values at that, because it focuses on decentral structures and is very transparent. And this is one of the reasons why the US Americans, which with the technology topics, they used to be trailblazers, but are not really focused on that because they are afraid that their monopolies will be destroyed through that rather than supported and reinforced. And I believe that I'm here in order to show what politicians can do. And this is why I would like to say that we should strengthen the research on blockchain technologies, especially here in Germany, because this gives us quite a lot of possibilities for German and European startups in order to have something against the giants. And this is one of the most interesting topics in this context, and I would like to get back to that in the discussion. So, Mr. Wambach, do you see any possibilities, any opportunities to use technical tools for that? And also in brackets with the addition that Adam Greenfield said that, we outed ourselves collectively, that nobody can actually explain what blockchain technologies are. So, and Adam Greenfield went even further and he said not even the creators of blockchain technologies could explain that. Would that be an idea to use technologies as a countermeasure? So I would like to hear your opinion about that. And this mega topic of data privacy, data protection, would that be reinforced through new technologies? As a competition economists, you hope for better use of technology. So, for example, you have tools, technological tools to compare prices, and that as a consumer, when you can use parallel services. The problem is that the consumers are not really focusing on data. There's no within the system. There is no force, no power that is interested in data protection. So that we're paying for data privacy. That is something that people are not really willing to do. So, and then if there are websites wanting fees for data protection and others not, and then people do not pay for data protection, so they're not really interested in data protection. And so as the Anti-Monopoly Commission, we really like the new regulation on data privacy, so that it covers all of Europe, so that you don't need to just go to Ireland to have an exemption, but it however affects as you said, the small players, so Google and Facebook, they know how to deal with it. And the small players, however, they have problems with the new regulation. And so that means that the new regulation is not always positive for competition. But then if we need to be frank, then when everybody talks about data privacy and Mr. Sendler, so that you need to want to force people to enjoy data privacy, and what can you say in favor of data privacy and what is positive about that if people do not see it positive? This is in fact a contradiction that can only resolve when you ban this type of business model. So what you see all the internet giants have been doing, so we're talking about the past, we're talking about what has been happening over the past 20 years and what is happening right now in the industrial use of internet is something completely different. And especially in Germany, we have a good example. Siemens has generated a platform for industrial apps, and that has become the they want to see that as an operating system for the Internet of Things. And they say right from the outset, every data that we collect on our clouds and analyze it, they are owned by the consumers. And Siemens has no control over them. And this is the quite contrary movement to what the internet giants have been doing. So because their principle is that we own all the data and we do whatever we want to do with them, and we earn our money with them. And then the regulators, they try to regulate it on the basis of the old antitrust laws. But when it is a basic need, so for example, the railways that we needed 100 years ago, the roads or mail services or telephone services, and if it is a basic need by the population, then we need to regulate it and offer it by the state so that it's not a business model at all. Mr. Gegenhuber, maybe you can come in on that. When you just assume that the networks are the way that they are and that there is this basic need and that in this 21st century this is part of providing for the citizens that is necessary, and how you can now put the digital corporations accountable. How could, for example, taxation issues? I mean, this is something that has been coming up in the discussion. Sometimes the SPD has talked about it, and sometimes the SPD finance minister in Brussels is against it one more time. So what are your observations? With regard to the data, I would like to say that I don't agree that consumers do not find data privacy important, because when you walk around in Berlin, so you see ads with Facebook advertising what is being done with their data, because I mean usually you don't see that. And this is something where we can have a starting point. And I believe that the perception of the consumers with regard to their private lives is something that they find more and more important. They are more interested in what is happening with their data, and that's something we can work on. And with a digital tax, I mean, this is something that I like. And I find it unfortunate that we have 3 countries that are putting a stop to it, because with Ireland, I mean, they are never in favor of taxes. And then we have Germany as well. And I find that very unfortunate. But I believe that this needs to be a wider discussion. It is about tax justice in Europe. So the reform of taxation is one part of it, but we need a social democratic approach that affects big corporations, and it is not only about one or the other giant, but rather something about the entire continent. And I believe that we need to focus on social democratic policies and not only focus on the internet giants, but rather in general try to answer the question how we can generate tax justice, so that we can't accept that the small shop on the corner that pays more taxes than Google. I would like to start the discussion about the digital tax and widen the discussion. So I am not the spokesperson of the finance minister, but I would like to give you 2 reasons why he is critical about it and why I personally am in favor of a digital tax nonetheless. You talked about the basic problem. The digital corporations, they pay 9.5% of the taxes, and the conventional corporations, they pay 23% in taxes. And so you see that there is a huge gap between the different types of corporations. And the question is, what is the best method in order to close that gap and at the same time to impose higher taxes on the digital corporations, because they are also obliged to be part of the social welfare. So what I don't like seeing is that they make big donations, and apparently they do say they are the do-gooders, but at the same time the figures are completely different. So can you tell me where you got the figure from? Because on the public debates we have figures such as Apple paying 0.05% in taxes that are paid by Apple in taxes, but Facebook and Google and Apple, these are the big ones that are in the discussion. I got the figures from the European Commission because this is something that is being discussed at the European level, and these are the figures that I've read there. So 9.5% is still a lot less than 23%, but these are the figures that I read in the reports of the European Commission. And this is why I believe Olaf Scholz is critical about this tax. And he said we are an export nation, and there is the concern that this paradigm shift in the taxation will no longer tax the corporations where they have their headquarters, but rather where they create their value, their added values. And with the digital companies, this is happening where the data is sold to advertising agencies, and so that they should be taxed heavier there. So, and then the concern, especially in the finance ministry, means that this is also transposed, and that at the end of the day, so for example, when the United States, they want to take revenge for or retaliation for that, so that we would have lower revenues in taxes because the profits from the digital tax, and this is something that I also read in the reports of the European Commission, they are given by 6 million euros, and this is not as high as many people may have expected that figure to be. But I nonetheless am in favor of a digital tax, just because for the very reason that we have been talking about, because I believe that it is about justice, about the perceived justice, so that when they need to pay lower taxes, then they would feel that it is unfair if there was no digital tax, and it would be a component towards taxation justice in Europe and in Germany. So, but it is also true that we should say to the big corporations that they should also take part in our welfare systems, that is in our education services and also the mobility services, that they also have to pay their share just like anybody else does. And this is why the resistance will be overcome. And I also heard that Sweden is also with them. So usually the Scandinavian countries are seen as the more progressive ones, but I hope that we will change our attitude. And Olaf Scholz said that he's waiting to see whether we can come to an international agreement, but I don't believe that we will have an international agreement in the near future, because for the US it would be completely irrational to accept something like that. Thank you very much, and we're going to take that over for the rest of the day, and Adriana Nales will be with us soon, and we will discuss that with her as well. So for the trade unions, this is also an important topic, and it's also an ambivalent one, because the jobs that we're talking about, when a person such as Donald Trump is enraged and then imposes automotive taxes, and this affects employees also in Germany. So what is your view on all that?
That is a dilemma. We have several dilemmas, including one which is a main motivation for finance ministers. Both Minister Scholz and his predecessor, Minister Schäuble, held the view that there is a lot of interest in Germany for making sure that we have a tight legal tax situation in the whole of Europe. This is to make sure that the main place of tax revenue is always the country where a company has its headquarters. That is the idea which doesn't work with a virtual company. Here we have to totally rethink this matter, and it's not just a matter of tax equality. for purely economic reasons, such a digital tax may be the one possible approach that helps us get structures in the way that will help our common good approach and public goods care. The second idea is something which doesn't really matter much to me, and I think all the unions are pretty much in agreement on that. It doesn't really matter whether Trump has more ideas against it. He's a bit of a loose cannon. Nobody can predict what he'll do next anyway. We can't even predict whether he's going to do anything there or whether this gentleman is going to attack some other area. So, I mean, Trump itself is an irritation. But there is another point I would like to talk about, which hasn't been sufficiently addressed. At the end of his speech, Mr. Wambach said very briefly that the collaborative commons shouldn't be viewed in too critical a view, and the sharing economy is something we as the unions don't consider to be per se negative either. But if a company like Airbnb is a free-for-all when it comes to tax evasion. In other words, if you are with Airbnb, you don't need to pay VAT. Or if someone like Uber, I mean, after all, we have to talk about what type of platform we're talking about, what type of service they offer. I mean, Uber does differ differentially from Facebook or Google. With Uber, we're talking about whether that platform acts as an employer, yes or no, and do the people who work for Uber have the status of employee, yes or no, with all the rights, obligations, and the social contributions and improvement that it means, or are they just sham self-employed? That is one of the reasons where I think we need to do something, and that is not something which says goodbye to collaborative commons or the digital economy. And another thing regarding the traditional platform, when we're talking about the big five, there is one other thing which we haven't yet touched upon, and that is the powerful position in the market. If you have such a powerful position, you tend to have a cartel situation for wages and salaries. So let's look at the big ones. In 2016, they had $20 billion worth in revenue. That would mean per head of person employed for these five platforms, that's about $335,000 profit that every single one who works there has generated. Now, let's look at the wage ratio for the five big ones. That's about 20%. So talking about this cartel of wages, and I'm not saying that's necessarily that people there work for little money or do poorly, but they don't get what they would actually be able to achieve, and they're far below what we would have in other countries. So if I'm looking at competition law, let's look at this, because it's quite amazing also how much and how similar the amount of profit is that the big fives are making. I think that's something to be considered. Certainly, that is one of the very difficult points. Thilo Bode, in his current book, describes the precarious working relationships that people have in Amazon. There are some Amazon employees in the US who have food coupons in order to feed themselves. I mean, we have a similar dispute with Amazon and the unions here in this country, although it's not as bad. But let's very briefly highlight this fact. Is it a good thing that there is this dispute with Amazon, or are you already despairing about achieving anything? Oh no, I never despair. But to some extent, just by virtue of being a union, we are almost used to having sometimes very long drawn-out disputes with the other side, especially when we have an anomaly in such a partnership. Sorry if I try to avoid your question a little here, because I suddenly thought of another aspect which I think is very important, coming back to the power of data. Let's look at all the sweatshops that exist in Bangladesh, for example, where all day long people work for these big digital platforms, and all they do is they check image content, because artificial intelligence just can't do that yet. So anything which is hostile, hate speech, or something like that needs to be identified. And you've got people there living at, sorry about saying that, absolutely crappy, excuse my French, conditions. But what they do is because they exercise human control. That is human supported AI. They are actually helping AI and make AI more and more perfect, because what they're doing feeds into AI, and at some stage face recognitions and all the other things in hate speech recognitions will work without human beings. And that's another aspect which is often not perceived, not taken seriously. That's something which has to do with the data power held by these big companies and the technology that makes this power possible. I think people must be made sensitive to this. And we can't just leave it by saying, well, the users simply don't have sufficient interest in data protection. Well, if they're not interested in it, we have to make sure that we can make them interested in it. How we do that, I don't know. But we're talking about a massive potential for damage for individuals and for the cohesion of whole societies. So that education is something that we need to do in Germany. Facebook seems to be informing us in Germany now, and maybe they are taking over some element of social responsibility now. But I think you have some other proposals which I would like to address in the next round. You talk about a robo-tax. That's one of the buzzwords you're talking about. Does robo-tax mean, well, how shall I put this? Or maybe you can explain that. But what it is about is that activities that used to be performed by people who were trained for a specific job, pay taxes on it, on the salaries they earn, and companies pay social contributions, and now you have a robo-tax. Is that the vision instead of that? No, that's not my vision, actually. It's not my idea. And it's not something I consider to be incredibly or worthwhile. But something which is reflected in our debate is that we have a big problem, namely, we are still thinking in the categories of an industrial society. And that's something which we consider to be a given. After all, it's been around for 250 years. But that is no longer so. When we're talking about monopolies, we had a wonderful explanation of the criteria for monopolies at the beginning. These internet giants, they're not producing anything. They're not manufacturing a product. Facebook does not create a product. They do algorithms, and they don't even do that themselves. They probably have click workers doing it for them. They have hired a few people, but not that many, especially compared to what old industry did. So what's happening here and now is that ideas, software is used to do business. And that's done because at the moment there is no way of protecting the property of data. And that's why Google, Facebook and all the others could simply march along. The business principle is a simple one. You offer a user's data to some service so that personalized advertising can be generated. Obviously, industry and the consumer goods manufacturers love that. It allows them to directly address customers because of the data they receive. And by the way, there are estimates now talking about how much which data are worth. And the data where people's social insurance number is involved are the most important ones, because then you know exactly what that person is insured for, who with, what illnesses or health risks someone poses. It costs a lot of money, such data. Other data cost less than a cent. So we need to rethink matters. We need to consider what the economy in the future is supposed to be like. Let me make one suggestion. If 250 years ago we had a discussion round like this one, when our industrial societies started to form and develop, 1769, James Watt had developed his machine so much that the steam engine could become the basis for the economy. At that time, there was no debate about the industrial society or about the economic system of what was then called a market economy. There were no economists. There were no sort of academic institutions comparable to what we have today. Quite apart from democracy, which didn't exist either. Certainly, democracy actually grew up with the industrial society. It came into being in the same century as our industrialized economy. But when we're discussing these questions today, we are just where people were 250 years ago when the old industry developed. We are witnessing something changing, but we can't really grasp it using our old terms and our old terminology. That's a problem. I think that's a very interesting approach because, I mean, nobody, neither here in the room nor anywhere else, knows where things will go. How many jobs will be lost or what will be created in the way of jobs? I mean, we put that aside because we'll be discussing these questions later. But Mr. Wambach, I wanted to go back to your sort of interim stock taking, if you like. Now that we've been spending some time discussing these questions, are you more or less happy, satisfied with your control of digital companies, monopolies, or are you going to bed very unhappy every night? Well, I think there is still a great deal that's left to be done, and the discussion here has touched on some of the relevant points. Data tax, robo-tax, these words are mentioned and spoken very quickly, but how is that to be implemented? I mean, robots have been around since the 1960s. Here in Germany, most companies have robots. I mean, actually, we've got the most robots per head of the company, as it were, or company workers. Industry uses robots all the time. So we need to think about that. But Ms. Nahles has suggested is sort of consistent in the sense that if data give you a competitive edge, then, yeah, you have to hand over data. Oh, it's pretty tough when you think it through to its logical conclusion and want to implement that. Talking about Amazon, all the data are personalized. And they haven't given anything back. I mean, we've got the data protection regulation now. They're not allowed to hand over the data. Anonymous data don't help. And maybe with Google it might help, but other companies have different data systems, and levying a tax on data is very different. The basic problem, you levy a tax where value is created. That's good in Germany because we're creating a lot of value and we're exporting a lot. But the alternative would be to change the system over to where consumption happens. But that would really hit our companies, or rather, wouldn't hit the companies. They would pay their taxes elsewhere, but we wouldn't get the tax revenue. So we have to think about which are the right processes to start. You're saying, are we happy? No, we're not happy. But equally, if you ask me, are we on the right track? I would say yes, because we have the right discussion. But there's no such thing as the one-size-fits-all, easy, quick solution. One has to consider what are the consequences of anything that we do. I've seen some people from the floor, so I would like to open this discussion to involve everybody. I've seen one person here and someone in the fourth row. Would you please identify yourselves briefly and use the microphone? Stefan Herwig. I've looked into the network economy a bit, and I was a bit irritated. I mean, all we thought were good contributions. They were so parts of the jigsaw, as it were, of things that we need to do, or rather what we missed doing in the last 10 years. I mean, why on earth are we starting the tax discussion now? Why didn't we do that 15 years ago? But there is one piece of the jigsaw that's missing, and it's a big piece, and I'm surprised. That's why I question to the economists and to politics. Apart from competitive issues and competition law, the question of whether these markets actually work in the economic sense that we need to address. I mean, the term of ownership and how to define ownership is one thing. I mean, data, who owns data, copyright issues, but we've got a regulatory paradise that we created for these platforms, not just in tax terms, but also when it comes to liability law. And we've got a lot of externalities, as we call them in economics. We've got fake news, hate speaks, election manipulation, a violation of personal rights, cyberspace violations. All of these things are actually made easier by the platforms, and we created a law of liabilities for them, which basically says, well, if you delete, that's fine, you're not liable any other way. Could you please come to your question? Yeah, the next point is network neutrality. 2/3 of all data traffic is no longer man-made, but bots and cookie-made. But all the same, these platforms don't pay anything for the structure they're using. And we always say, no, we need faster networks, faster this and that and the other. But that means we are subsidizing big data because it guarantees the platform what they do. Now, these are two big areas. And what is your question? Please come up with your question. My question is, why is the area of market failure, which is so essential, an area you're not tackling in this debate. You're not doing it in politics because there's no legislator tackling this, and nobody is looking at this from the economic point of view either. Thank you. Thomas Gegenhuber. I'm really curious how you react to that. Well, I'm not an economist, I'm a business management. No, never mind. It's to find the distinction. But I think, speaking seriously now, that obviously we can discuss these matters, but I'm definitely for network neutrality, and I think the way that old companies, especially in the US, have pushed through their interests in order to abolish that is shameful. A free internet needs this neutrality, but I think the supreme principle for regulation should be, first of all, to understand how the internet economy is working. And in the case of platforms, one has to understand that the power is demand-side driven. But we should also understand that there is regulation, and some regulation can lead to market failure. Linktex or various performance protection measures, which they tried in Spain, driven by the old economy, publishers, which meant that these publishers actually had less traffic because Google News stopped their service. Well, that's not the sort of regulation I'm in favour of. When we're talking about regulation and market failure, we should also ask ourselves, have we really understood this new world we're living in? Thank you. Now, in the fourth row, please. I don't really understand why the waste of resources is something which is completely neglected. Shouldn't that be addressed as well? I mean, you can't say it's all down to monopolies, which is true as far as it goes, but we ourselves have a lot to do with it. If we think, and I'm online, of course, as well, but in all sorts of different situations, we need to have more products more quickly than before. Well, at the same time, we're talking about protecting the climate, the environment, and so on, but the basic assumption is that, we can't generate unlimited energy, but in terms of the internet, it doesn't seem to play a role. How can we link up these two sides? Is there a way? Thank you for this interesting question. A moment ago, we briefly alluded to it, so I'll play that back to you. Mr. Sandra, no, who was it? Who was the blockchain fan? No, it was the two of you and Ms. Kampmann, absolutely. So why don't you answer this one then? So this issue about energy consumption and the various desert areas where the computer centers are now running and, blinking and hissing. Oh, absolutely. The question of the use of energy is absolutely essential. Also shows that there is so little in this world that is either good or bad. And I think the blockchain, from a theory of democracy point of view, has great benefits, but the great use of energy is definitely a downside of it. That's always a risk. When we're looking how political areas of application can be created, what other things we need to factor in. And I don't know whether the question also wanted to talk about what are the materials that the smartphones are made of that we all carry with us. After all, that's quite important when we're talking about the use of resources as well. And in order to answer your question, what you're really getting at is an issue which is general, but it basically means what is our responsibility as individual consumers, not just vis-a-vis our own data, because that's very personal, but by buying smartphones, by maybe using blockchain applications. By what we do, we might be a burden to the climate, or resources, or jobs. And of course, the answer, what politics can do, we can make people aware of these issues. And I think we need to have a more broadly based public debate about blockchain, the pros, the cons, risks, opportunities. I mean, publicly, that's not debated sufficiently so far. This is something which we can maybe kickstart politically. Second area is education. And we can pick up on that. And when we talked about data, it was addressed. How can we make sure that young people develop a critical way of using their own data and our resources, which also hinge on this digitizing setup? How can we make sure that people are much more aware of what they're doing? And of course, we don't want to talk about digitization in school or education in a wider sense, but there is a great deal still to be done, and we're not looking good in this respect here. And then we in politics, maybe we've ignored it for too long. And I really want us all to wake up, because these questions are very important. Not just how society develops, but how every single one of us develops. And we need to do more about that. And the German federal states, whose task education is, need to do more there. Will the Social Democrats dare do that? After all, you've watched how the two historical issues that the Greens got burnt on, like, the what was it? It was last but one election campaign when they campaigned on higher taxes, and then on the Veggie Day, I mean, they tried to tell the voters, think what you're doing. Will you in the Social Democratic Party be brave enough to do that? I think it's not about banning things. The idea is to make people aware of something. That's what really counts. But if you want to get at the fact that Social Democrats, I think, should focus much more on the environment and on climate change. If you're saying that, then I can only agree. Yes, we have to do far more in this respect, and the questions that you addressed have a lot to do with it. Achim, no, Ulrich Sendler, sorry. You first, and yes, I have somebody else from the audience on my list. I find it a bit tough to listen to all these things we've heard for about 6 months from every politician of whatever colour. People need to be sensitized. People need to be made aware. Everybody is responsible for what's going wrong in this country. I think the question that was asked here from the member of the audience is something which cannot simply be resolved by saying we people as the users of the various services need to act differently. The only way of solving is for governments to take over responsibility for this area. That's the only way it can be done. I think we have to be fair to ask Ms. Kampmann to react to that. Well, as a Social Democrat, I would never say that all responsibility should be given to the citizens. That's done by the FDP, the Liberal Party in Germany. I had a debate with them about that very issue, but all the same, I still think that children and young people need to be more aware of how they use their own data without trying that governments and the European Union, I'm not saying they should be relieved of all responsibility. All the questions that we've been addressing today make clear there is a need for regulatory work and for political responsibility to be assumed. And I'm happy to be in digital politics because I think it's an exciting time and I want to have that responsibility. And all the risks that we've discussed today are risks where I would like to contribute to those risks being reduced. And I'm very happy that so many people have recognised this and that particularly the European Union has recognised this, because digital policy is also an appeal to Europe, to a strong European Union, because there are so many things we can't do as individual nation states. And I'm happy to bear that responsibility, and I would happily try and redirect matters that are going wrong in the right direction and use the opportunities of digitisation. Because as somebody has said, I'm not against the internet, and that's really the crux. I mean, the internet is here to stay, but we need to regulate it. And digitisation has to serve society and not companies. That's our job, and that's what we are facing up to. Right, now up to you. Siegfried Richter, German, AGS 60 plus for Hesse. We have one issue which is crucial to show our responsibility for the younger generation. That's how to pay for pensions. People have said rightly that many jobs will be lost through digitization and replaced by a digital system. Well, we've been demanding for years that a value creation levy be charged. I mean, we had all sorts of different taxes in the past, but we know now that whatever has been tried hasn't worked, because wherever jobs are replaced, the value is still created, even though the jobs are replaced. And we want to do something to help the next generation, and not enough is happening here. That was one point I wanted to make. And another point, I have to contradict what you're saying. Internet organizations like Google, you said, don't produce anything. I think you should know that near San Francisco, they're actually running a medical research center where they're employing about 1,000 really high caliber scientists from biology, medicine, various areas of technology. And they're developing systems, therapies, that one day will affect all of us. It goes all the way to genetic manipulation in the interest of preventive care against certain diseases. To what extent have we addressed that issue? Because unless the ethical questions aren't addressed very early, and how to, for example, reimburse a cure, a therapy, how will health funds react that? If you have one cure, one drug that will remedy a situation forever, but what do you do if you pay 1 million? I mean, all of these matters need to be addressed. Because if you have the old style healthcare, it would cost the same, only over many years instead of as a one-off payment. Now my question, why have these two issues not been addressed as they should have been? So that goes back to Ms. Kampmann and Mr. Wambach, I think. Well, there are 2 points I'd like to pick up on. One point is the fear for the loss of jobs. There are quite a number of academic studies now which show that the initial surveys were problematical, also from a methodological, but also too pessimistic, because what we're seeing is not jobs being lost, but a change of jobs. We see some tasks being lost, but not the jobs. We have to prepare people for a structural change. We've done various surveys about automation and the increased use of robotics, because that's an ongoing process. We've seen that jobs have simply changed, and in Germany we've done quite well providing flanking support. An example is always the old car mechanic is now mechatronic. So that means embracing change and adapting to it. But of course digitization is so rapid that it's not enough just to do that in basic education, but also in vocational training and skilling measures, things later. So we need to understand structural change and provide the right adaptive methods. The second point, not your question really, but I'd still like to pick up on it. Google has a huge R&D budget. They're doing a lot of research. We're discussing AI and whether or not we do 5 million. They're already spending much more than that. And, that we need to be worried. You basically say, yes, it's legitimate to say so, but we should be worried that our R&D development is happening elsewhere. Our top people go to the US. They don't stay here because here they can't do that sort of cutting-edge research. And the big companies are also moving to Israel or the US, Daimler, Volkswagen. They don't need the German market. If we don't train people as they should be trained, they have research centers anywhere in the world. They have their digital hubs, but in Israel or in the US. And looking at the medium-sized industry, they're actually reducing. That sector of business is shrinking. The top medium-sized businesses are still hanging on, but others not just spend less on energy, which you might welcome, but they also have fewer patents and fewer innovative products. If you ask them, have you developed something new, you hear fewer and fewer answers. And that's a concern I have, that our business model, we're always saying there's R&D in small companies, but we're now seeing that it's been moved to the big companies. Now I'm moving over to Ms. Kampmann, Mr. Sendler once again, and would announce that I've seen. I will now close the list after these two people have given their reaction. Okay, from my angle, the two questions you've asked are absolutely crucial, namely, what happens if the big companies, the most valuable companies we have, are no longer headquartered in Europe and Germany, but in the US, for example, because that would raise a lot of new issues regarding equality in distribution. And the question also, how shall we finance our welfare state in the future? It's one of the biggest issues. And one crucial political answer is the digitax. That's why I'm saying we've got to get round to introducing a digital tax. Another one could be the robo-tax or machine tax. We haven't discussed that in detail today, but if we see that more and more jobs are being taken by AI, by robots, how can we arrive at a situation where these companies are taxed in such a way that they still contribute to the common good? These are partial political answers, which I think are very crucial, though. And your question about the ethical aspects, that is something which we in society as a whole haven't discussed enough. In Silicon Valley, people say anything that goes from a technological point of view will be done. And I think it's our job in Europe to debate what it is that we really want to implement and where digitization has a benefit for us, for society, for human beings, or where is technology just a raison d'etre in itself and good for nothing else. And we now have a commission in the German parliament which will look into these ethical questions, and that's important. Equally important is that this debate doesn't stay in parliament, but is carried into society as a whole, that we all address what do we want to do, what's the added value for us as society, where are the ethical boundaries where we say, this is too far, that goes beyond what we can accept. So these are very important questions, so thanks for raising that issue. Well, regarding the ethical issue, so far, all over the world, there's only been one ethics commission that looked into digitization in industry, and that was actually done in Germany, the debate on autonomous driving. Why isn't there more like that? We would need hundreds of such commissions, all looking into how software is to be developed. So much on that. The other question, Google is a producer or is not a producer. Obviously, Google is a producer in a sense, and they're quite active in that, also in healthcare. But I would like to put a counterpoint to this continuous feeling, the American Silicon Valley, they're so far ahead of us that we can't possibly catch up. Google has put 7% into the German Research Center in AI. And why have they done it? Because we are the furthest in this research. Google, Microsoft, IBM with Watson, Amazon Web Services, all the AI providers from Silicon Valley have now become the most important exhibitors in the digital factory of Hanover Fair. Why is that? Because what is now happening, what is about to happen, is happening in Germany.
Beschäftigen, die uns wirklich jetzt auf den Nägeln brennen, die auch unsere Industriearbeitsplätze betreffen und wo wir bitte nicht den Fehler machen sollten, den die Amerikaner gemacht haben. Mit den Internetgiganten sind sie groß geworden, aber gleichzeitig haben sie einen Rust Belt geschaffen, dem sie den Trump.
At the same time, they created a network which is thanks to Trump, and we should do it differently in this country. Thank you. Thank you very much for this discussion, which I must conclude here and now because we have intended to keep to our time schedule. After all, we have a long day ahead of us, so we need to be disciplined. Thanks very much for this exciting debate. Thanks, everybody, for your interest and for staying with us. And all through the day, we're going to meet in different forums, but then reconvene here. So next time we're meeting here for another focus is at 1 o'clock, 1300 hours. Let me give you a housekeeping announcement, though, before we finish. As you can see, also from the plan you have, where you need to go to attend the forum that you're registered for. We know that there are some forums which are more popular than others, and some may go beyond what the room allows. So please be flexible. If you see that one room is full to bursting and people are packed, then please try and find another forum. Only then, of course. Thanks very much. Enjoy the forums. Oh, one more remark regarding lunch. Everybody who will have a forum in house number 2 can have lunch there at 12 o'clock. And as I said, at 1300 hours, we reconvene here. Thanks.